We're in chapter 26 of your world history on the Cold War, and we're going on to talk about the conflicts in Latin America, which includes the Cuban crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Bay of Pigs, conflicts between President Kennedy in America and Fidel Castro. So let us begin here. Cuba, the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. You can see how close Cuba is to America here. Here's Florida in the United States, and you see where Cuba is here. So very close. This is very close to our country. So of course, Americans are alarmed at a communist country being so close to us. And you'll see why. Communists spread through Latin America primarily from Cuba. Since 1934, Cuba had been ruled by the dictator Fulgencio Batista. And under his rule, Cuba prospered because of his ties with the United States, but many Cubans still lived in poverty. On July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro, a young Cuban lawyer with a record of violence and revolutionary activity, started a revolution against Batista's government. He and his followers were captured and imprisoned, and he was released 2 years later. So here you can see some pictures. You can see again, here's Cuba, here's down here, you'll see this is Fidel Castro here, and this is Batista. Batista being friends of the United States, and we'll find what happens with Fidel Castro. And as it says here, he had a history of violence and revolution. So you can imagine. So let's go on. Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement. After 2 years in prison, Castro organized the 26th of July movement, named after his aborted attempt to seize the Cuban government in 1953. So in December of 1956, 3 years later, after he got out of prison, he had a small force of men in an invasion that went from Mexico to Cuba. Only 12 of these men, including Castro, survived. But undaunted, he worked in the hills, building a new army and waging a relentless guerrilla warfare on the Cubans. The Castro Revolution gained a reputation as a war of liberation. That means freedom. And he was considered, even in America, as a hero and a reformer. But in January of 1959, the Batista government lost support of the United States, and as Batista fled the country, Castro then rode triumphantly into Havana atop of a tank, saying now he was taking over the Cuba at this time. Cuba's new dictator, Fidel Castro. Many people in the United States considered Castro a freedom fighter and a agrarian reformer, thinking he was a good thing, right? Thinking this was a good thing. In fact, many thought he was a hero. And he continued to receive support from the liberal America journalists and officials in the United States Department and even in the CIA. But soon afterward, he secured this power. Castro showed his true colors. Cuba had exchanged one dictator for a worse dictator. Although Batista was considered a dictator, he was not considered communist. Castro began sweeping a program of economic and social reform that transformed Cuba into a communist state. So you see here, you can see these pictures of Fidel Castro taking over Cuba. Castro's communist reforms. Okay, so what were these reforms? Well, thousands of people were executed or imprisoned with mock trials. $1 billion in American-owned properties and businesses were seized. And Castro began receiving massive aid from where? Of course, from the Soviet Union, Russia. In 1960, the meeting at the United Nations, Castro and Khrushchev embraced each other and said they were comrades. So friends of the USSR, friends of Russia. The United States responded to Castro's anti-American actions by barring Cuban imports and limiting exports to Cuba. So this was a very small thing. But in 1961, just before President Eisenhower left office, the United States broke off relations with Cuba. You see here, in these pictures, as you can see, let me back up a little bit here. You see here the people fleeing when Castro came in, and all the things that were going on, the terrorism and the violence and the seizing of property. A lot of people wanted to leave Cuba and come to America. And you can see all the people, even people came on boats to try to get to Florida. The Bay of Pigs. Okay, wonder what that is. What? The Bay of Pigs. You can see where the Bay of Pigs is. Here's Havana, the capital of Cuba, and here's where the Bay of Pigs is. And as you go here, you'll see this is this is all of Cuba. This island, as you see here, and you see Bay of Pigs is the CIA's Cuban disaster. April 1961. President Kennedy was president during this time. In 1961, President Kennedy was informed of a plan for a force of Cuban exiles to initiate an anti-Castro revolution. So some people wanted to overthrow Castro, right? President decided to allow the plan to proceed on a limited basis, and they were told they would receive American air cover. So on April 17, 1961, an American trained force of 1,600 exiled Cuban freedom fighters invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. But despite the promise of American aid by President Kennedy, he canceled the air support vital to the operation's success. So the invasion was brutally crushed. Castro had an excuse to execute the prisoners he had in custody and imprisoned thousands more. In May of 1961, Castro openly declared Cuba now to be a communist state and announced that there would be no more elections. So in the midst of the Bay of Pigs was a big defeat for America and a big defeat for President Kennedy at that time, for he had promised the freedom fighters that they had come in and they were going to fight for independence of Cuba, and he promised that the United States would support them by the air support, and did not show up in the nick of time. And so of course this gave Fidel Castro the excuse so that he could just start executing those prisoners he had confiscated, and also basically just executing thousands, just like they did. Isn't that the way communist countries do? So the Bay of Pigs, an American failed on this account. On to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on September 2nd, 1962, the Soviet Union, Russia, announced that it had agreed to supply Cuba with Russian arms and special defense against what they called American imperialism. Now you're going to hear this. That's what the communists will talk about when they talk about America, the world imperialism. And so you'll see this throughout. So President Kennedy announced a U.S. air and naval quarantine of Cuba because the Soviets had installed offensive missiles and bomber bases pointed directly against the United States. Soviet ships carried weapons to Cuba, and the world stood anxiously on the brink of war. Nuclear war, in fact. So what happened with Khrushchev and what happened with Russia? They actually, in bringing these missiles, they would bring to Cuba, they would point to protect Cuba's communism, point them directly at America. As you can see in this picture, here is Cuba, here is Florida, and they pointed at all of the cities. We have them pointed at Los Angeles, onto Denver, onto Chicago here. One pointed at Washington, D.C., one at New York. You can imagine. So as Americans and as President Kennedy had to take in account of this and to go for negotiations in some way to Russia. Kennedy and Khrushchev met. They met on October 28th. President Kennedy and the Soviet Premier Khrushchev of Russia, USSR, the Soviets, agreed to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets pledged to halt the construction of missile bases in Cuba, removing their weapons under a United Nations supervision. So basically saying, look, we're going to go through the United Nations to do this. And America agreed to end the quarantine and gave assurance that Cuba would not be invaded. So here's a plus. Repression of freedom. So what else happened in Cuba from this point? Well, hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled their homeland during Castro's revolution. Many Christians and church leaders left the country after Castro came to power and threatening their freedom. Communism always brings religious persecution, especially to Christians. By the end of the 1960s, over 1 million Cubans had fled. 1 million. Most of them came to the United States. Castro's repression of freedom had devastating effects on its economy, of course. Cuba quickly went from being one of the wealthiest countries to being one of the poorest countries due to the communism. So here we have again pictures of people fleeing Cuba. Here's a picture of him as a freedom fighter there. And down here you see, here's the United States, and again, Cuba. We have Guantanamo Bay down here, and up here we have on to Havana, and as you can see where the Bay of Pigs is, and on over here. And look how close Cuba is to Key West, Florida. Very close. Castro's dependence on the Soviet Union's aid. So the Cubans faced housing and food shortages under Castro. He had seized all of the businesses and all of the American businesses. Castro had to ask the Soviet Union for aid then, which in the early 1980s would amount to $4 billion a year. But in 1981, Castro was forced to add some elements of capitalism into the economy just to keep his regime afloat. So was he totally communist? Well, he was until he realized that he needed some businesses and would focus on some elements of capitalism, especially from the United States. But he made it clear he would not abandon his overhauled communist philosophy. Here we have pictures of how the country looked, and here's of course Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. Cuban incited revolutions. Castro secured communism in Cuba, but he also helped to incite communist revolutions all around the world, especially in Latin America and Africa. Most of these countries were considered third world countries in that they didn't have stable governments, and there was a lot of poverty and confusion in these countries. Beginning in 1970, Cuban forces actively and politically agitated a number of Latin American and Caribbean countries and also in Africa. So you'll see this, and we'll note a couple of them, but there were many. Cuba aided a group of communist revolutionaries called the Sandinistas to oust President Anastasio Somoza in 1979 in Nicaragua. By 1981, some 5,000 Cuban troops were in Nicaragua helping the Sandinistas secure their communist military regime. Castro used Nicaragua as a base to extend Marxist influence in Central America. So what's going on? Castro's going into other countries to help them to become communist. And he finds that Nicaragua is a good place so that he could launch out his military aid to any other Central America and South American countries to join him in communism. South America, Argentina. See where Argentina is? Down here you see where the tail of South America is here. And you'll see here's Chile and Argentina. We're going to talk about these two countries. Brazil is in the north and Paraguay and Bolivia. But we're going to talk about southern here. And this is Argentina. So Argentina in 1940 was a prosperous economy, a prospering nation. In 1943, Colonel Juan Perón led a successful military overthrow of the government. He pursued now a socialist program, or leading to communism, and nationalized many businesses. When you say nationalized, the government took over the businesses, of people's businesses. By 1950s, he resorted to an outright tyranny. Argentina now faced an economic crisis. In 1955, a military coup sent Perón into exile in Spain, but his supporters, the Peronistas, you would call them, remained active in the government. In 1973, Perón returned from exile and again became president. His third wife was elected vice president. Isabel Perón succeeded her husband upon his death in 1974, becoming the first woman to head a government in the Western Hemisphere. She was deposed of in 1976 with much political violence. So here we have the picture of another dictator, Colonel Juan Perón, and even going on to his wife, Isabel Perón, and ruling in the communist, bringing communism into Argentina, with the support of Fidel Castro, of course, and Russia, the USSR, Soviet Union. Chile, the first non-communist country where Marxists came to power through election. So Chile too is going into communist, and they had an election, although now they think this election was probably rigged. But in 1970, after winning 36% of the popular votes in a three-man race, Salvador Allende was chosen president. He was supported by a coalition of leftist parties that were dominated by communists and socialists. Allende was a pro-Soviet, and that's pro-Soviet Russia, and immediately established diplomatic relationships with Cuba and communist China, along with Russia. He nationalized much of the nation's businesses. That means nationalized the business, the government took over the businesses, and set a land reform scheme through which land was taken from any owners of land, nobody could own land, and redistributed among who they wanted to, saying they were redistributing among peasants. Allende seized the copper mines of several American companies, promising to compensate them, but canceled the claim. Allende's Marxist policy quickly led to the economic chaos and caused food shortages. 3 years of communism ruined Chile, ruined it politically and economically. September 1973, Allende, his regime was ended by an anti-communist military coup. And then Allende, what did he do? He committed suicide, and Augusto Pinochet assumed the office of president. So here we have a picture of Allende. So definitely going through communism in Chile. Chile's Allende to Pinochet. Allende's Marxist policy quickly led to the economic chaos, causing much food shortages, as I said before, in Chile. 3 years of communism ruined it. In September 1973, Allende regime was ended by an anti-communist military coup. Oh, I already said some of this. Repeat it here. Pinochet did allow commerce to come back in the country then. So here we have a picture of Pinochet and Allende. And basically what happened there now, Pinochet's allowing some commerce to come back and going away, traveling away from communism. On to Mexico. Early in 1970, the Mexican government greatly expanded its control over the foreign and domestic businesses and began a land redistribution program. So going on, both the socialist policies combined with international economic problems led to ravaging inflation and economic chaos. Mexico's currency was devalued twice in 1976. Late in 1976, a new administration reduced some of the economic controls to encourage private enterprise, temporarily alleviating some of the problems. But the discovery of vast quantities of oil in the late 1970s increased Mexico's economic potential. By 1981, Mexico had risen to 4th place among the oil-producing nations of the world. So you can see how Mexico here was greatly influenced, by socialist policies. And as socialism came on down, its inflation and economic problems increased. But then we see later on the vast quantities of oil greatly increased Mexico out of this hump. Even now, though, socialism is very common in Mexico. So we can see how communism spread and on down to South America, and we'll see in the next few videos how communism went into Africa.